Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask you here in-house if you'll be so kind to check cell phones to see that they've been put on silence as a courtesy to our speaker. It is always appreciated. Of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us here at speaker@heritage.org. And we, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage following the presentation for your future reference. We're pleased today to co-host the program with our friends at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. For those unfamiliar with ISI, it was founded in 1953 and continues to advance its long-standing mission of educating for liberty by ensuring that college students understand and advance the timeless principles that made and make America free and prosperous. It's ISI's special focus to prepare young people for a lifetime of leadership, and we are pleased that they could sponsor with us today. Our guest lecturer is Garland S. Tucker III. He is also author of The High Tide of American Conservatism, Davis, Coolidge, and the 1924 election. He has written for National Review, The Washington Times, as well as other leading publications, and is also a frequent media guest on major radio and television networks. Mr. Tucker serves as chairman and CEO of Triangle Capital Corporation, a publicly traded specialty finance company. He is a graduate of Washington and Lee and has an MBA from the Harvard Business School. He is also a former member of the New York Stock Exchange and may not know that temporarily, the New York Stock Exchange has suspended trading on a technical issue. So some people are playing funds today worrying about the stock. But apparently it's like all of our computers. They don't always work like they're supposed to. He also serves on a number of boards for companies, schools, and other charitable organizations. And until today, I had no idea that he was familiar and good friends with the Delahoyte family of North Carolina, just to embarrass Maggie, who's at the back of the room. But we're glad to welcome you here and look forward to the presentation on conservative heroes.
John, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I don't know what the technical glitch is at the New York Stock Exchange, but maybe we ought to take a minute and everybody pull out his cell phone and see how his stocks are doing or her stocks are doing. Or maybe it's better not to know. So, but thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I want to take just a few minutes to try to tell you why I wrote the book and as much about it as I can in 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to have time for questions, which, at least for me, is always the most interesting part and might be for you as well. But let's jump right into the why I wrote the book and what I hope the book accomplishes, and I'll try to give you a little bit of a feel for the 14 leaders that I've highlighted in the book. But in the introduction, I use a quote that I had found from Secretary of War Newton Baker. He was served in Wilson's administration and was actually wound up being a pretty conservative Democrat, and he was writing to a friend about his own political career, and he used these words, which I expropriated and used in the book. He said, "I was one of a faithful band fighting a battle for a philosophy as old as the Republic itself." And so I grabbed those words, and in my introduction to the book, I offer a definition of American conservatism, which is a philosophy. I agree with Baker. It's a philosophy as old as the Republic itself. And it then traces the development and implementation of this philosophy through the 200 years plus of American history in the lives and writings of a faithful band, in this case 14 leaders that I would argue really shaped America, and they certainly shaped the conservative movement in America. Now, some of these leaders are very well known, but others are hardly known at all, and I would say that one of the fun aspects of writing a book like this is you get to pick, or I got to pick my own 14 heroes. Now, if you've seen the book, you'll notice that there's a foreword written by Amity Shlays, who hopefully all of you know. Amity, she's a very well-known and I think very skilled real historian, not an amateur historian like me. And in her foreword, she says, not everyone will select the same heroes that Tucker does. And I'll just say up front that that's okay, that hopefully will stimulate a little debate, and maybe at the question and answer period you might want to challenge me on some that were included or suggest some that were not included. But the main point is that I think examining these leaders, these 14 leaders, allows us to bring the foundational principles of conservatism into sharper focus and to see how these principles were lived out in the lives and writings and careers of these 14 leaders. I begin the book with a very short introductory segment on what is American conservatism. And I would say that in writing the book, it's my hope that this will be helpful to conservatives in general, but especially hope it'll be helpful to young conservatives who are trying to think through what these issues, what their principles should be, what the issues are, how their principles should be applied. And in introducing the question of what is American conservatism, I would suggest that there are 5 basic principles that I think all conservatives could pretty much agree on. There's certainly other principles that could have been added, but I think these 5 are pretty basic, pretty foundational. The first one's what I would call a realistic view of human nature, and that is that basically conservatives differ from liberals or progressives in that the conservatives just don't believe that human nature is getting better over time. And we certainly don't believe that government is the agent to perfect human nature, and liberals believe the opposite of that. In fact, I would say conservatives believe that the American Republic was founded not to reform human nature, but rather to establish some useful boundaries within which human nature might flourish. The second principle is the thought that the primary roles of government are 2. They're number 1, to establish order, and number 2, to preserve or extend liberty. And I acknowledge in the writing on this that there's certainly a tension between these 2 roles, and in fact the first chapter in the book, which focuses on Jefferson and Madison, a lot of their correspondence was in working out what the right relationship should be between establishing order and extending or preserving freedom. The third principle or canon of conservatism is that government should really be strictly limited. A conservative, American conservative, pretty much says that those 2 roles that I just gave you as the second principle, you should really stop there, that there's not much that government should do past those. And again, anchoring it back to the very founding of the Republic, some of the founders, and particularly Jefferson, in summing up his sum of good government, it sounds like you stick pretty close to those 2 primary roles. But again, the concept of limited government is one that pops up over and over again when we look at the 14 lives. The fourth principle is the importance of property rights, the crucial link between individual liberty, civil rights, and property rights. As Paul Johnson, the historian, has written, all the founders derived from John Locke the notion that security of one's property was intimately linked to one's freedom. It's a basic conservative view. And then the fifth point, and I think an important one, is that conservatives believe that the social and political life of any community, or certainly any country, depends on private, individually held virtues. And in the case of the American Republic, those individually held beliefs or virtues are very much grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So these are the 5 main concepts. I don't think there's anything too new or controversial about those as far as conservatives go. Again, there are others that could be added, but I think most conservatives would agree on these. So in the few minutes I've got left, I want to turn to the 14 leaders. And I guess my objective is to give you as much of a sense as I can of the 14, knowing that some of them are well known to you, others I suspect are not known at all, and my hope is that you'll be interested enough to want to buy and read the book. So, but the important overarching theme of looking at the 14 is that in the lives, writings, achievements, and in the failures, in some instances, of these leaders, you can see the 5 principles of conservatism that I just mentioned. You can see these principles lived out with clarity and with integrity and also civility. So let's look at the 14 very quickly. First, the first chapter starts with Jefferson and Madison, and it focuses very narrowly on the 12 years before Jefferson was elected president. He was elected president in 1800. So these were the 12 years when Jefferson and Madison were in the opposition to the Federalist programs that were being initiated, the Federalist administration. And it was in these years, these 12 years, that Jefferson and Madison, first of all, wrestled with what they thought the fair relationship between establishing order and preserving freedom. But also they wrote a lot about the importance of limited government. And it's from these writings that conservatives have really found a foundational strong point. Again, when you think of Jefferson and Madison are obviously well known to everyone here, and there have been books and books and books written on both men. I would suggest there's nothing new. I don't think there's anything new in what I've written, but I think it's important in that it anchors the story of American conservatism back to the beginning of the Republic. And I think the view of limited government from these two men is very important. Now, arguably, Jefferson and Madison became a bit more expansive in their view of limited government when they became president, but they never disavowed the view of limited government. And again, this chapter focuses very much on those first 12 years. The second chapter focuses on two men that I'm sure certainly are not nearly as well known, and I suspect aren't known at all to most of you, at least one of the two. John Randolph from Virginia might ring a faint bell with some of you, but the second man in the chapter, Nathaniel Macon, I suspect doesn't ring a bell with anyone here. But I think this makes a very interesting chapter, maybe because they are not so well known. But these two men were, well, first of all, Macon was the Speaker of the House, of the U.S. House under Jefferson, was a leader in the Jeffersonian party. Randolph was the floor leader for the Jeffersonians in the House and was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Excuse me. Excuse me. These two men had a lifelong friendship, and in fact, they, over a 40-year career, each of them had a 40-year career in Congress. They actually roomed together at the same boarding house, and they were just basically inseparable, but very different personally, but very similar in their political views. They were what they called old Republicans, or they adhered to the Republican views of 1800, the Revolution of 1800. And as Jefferson and Madison became a bit more expansive in their views, Macon and Randolph very much adhered to what they saw as those original views of limited government. And they and a small group of their cohorts became known as a group that was called the Tertium Quids, the third things. They were almost like a third party. They but they kept alive these Republican or conservative views. And in fact, Russell Kirk, in his writings in the 20th century, credits Randolph as much as anybody else for keeping alive those views well into the 19th century. Just a couple of things about, Russell Kirk said that Randolph's speeches were perhaps some of the most brilliant in American history. I can tell you about Nathaniel Macon that he was a hero of Jesse Helms, and there was some argument as to whether Jesse Helms or Nathaniel Macon had cast the most negative votes in Congress. I think Nathaniel Macon probably had the record, but anyway, Jesse Helms was a big admirer of his. So again, two men that you probably did not know much about. The next chapter is probably the most controversial in the book. It's the leader is John C. Calhoun. In fact, in her foreword, Amity Schlaze, I think, summed it up pretty well. She said, Calhoun's support of slavery has been enough to see him wiped out from children's textbooks, yet the omission leaves younger citizens in the dark about some valuable history. The majority of Calhoun's career, was a long career in Congress, was focused on issues other than slavery, things like the tariff, the national bank, centralization schemes such as Clay's American Plan. But increasingly, and towards sort of the end of his career, his defense of slavery became the dominant theme, and it's that sadly he's remembered for his defense of slavery. But again, Russell Kirk, writing in the 20th century, I think put Calhoun in real perspective for us. He was intellectually probably one of the most impressive American politicians ever. His breadth of understanding, his depth of knowledge, his ability to articulate it was unquestionable. It was really unparalleled in his time, and that's saying something because he was in the Senate with Webster and Clay. But I think I hope that the chapter gives Calhoun his due. I think he deserves more credit and certainly kept alive some very basic conservative principles, limited government, state and local, the importance of state and local government. And trying to move along quickly here, the book jumps over the Civil War and lands in the middle of the last half of the 19th century on Grover Cleveland, a name that will hopefully be recognized by people here, but it's probably one that you don't know much about. But Cleveland, I would argue, was certainly the last conservative Democrat to serve as president. He served in the 1880s and 90s. He was a formidable individual in two senses of that word. Intellectually, he was formidable, and physically, he weighed about 280 pounds, so he was pretty formidable from a physical standpoint. And interestingly, his rise to the presidency was nothing short of meteoric. Between Lincoln, the Civil War, and Wilson, there was only one Democratic president elected, and that was Cleveland. And 3 years before he was, for his career, he had been sort of a mediocre lawyer in Buffalo, New York, was elected mayor of Buffalo, attracted the attention of the state Democratic Party. They ran him for governor. He was elected governor, and then in less than 3 years, he had been nominated and was elected president of the United States. And there's a funny quote in the book that he wrote one of his friends. He'd been in office about 3 months and said he still woke up every morning in the White House and would rub his eyes and say, am I really here? So people really didn't know a whole lot about what Cleveland was going to do when he was elected. They knew he was honest. He had a reputation of taking on the political bosses in New York. But what they found out pretty quickly was that he was a very principled Jeffersonian limited government conservative. And he was just relentless. Well, first of all, he was very honest in a pretty corrupt period. The Republican Party of that period was the party of centralization and was involved in a lot of what we would call today crony capitalism. And Cleveland would just have none of that. He was very honest, but beyond that, he was relentless in trying to wring out excess spending. He still holds the record for the number of vetoes as a president. In his 2 terms, he vetoed over 500 spending measures. And he just was relentless and very, very focused, and a very popular president on top of that. I'll read you, I love this quote. It was in 1887, one of his many veto messages, but he vetoed this small spending bill. And he said, a prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of the federal government's power and duty should be steadfastly resisted, so that, though the people support the government should not support the people. That's a snapshot of Grover Cleveland. Again, the last conservative Democrat to be elected. From Cleveland in the 1880s, 1890s, we jump over the progressive period. That's sort of the high tide of progressivism, I guess, was 1912 with Wilson's election and Teddy Roosevelt running as a bull moose progressive, and Taft trying to sound progressive in the mix as well. But when you get to the 1920s, there's a very different picture. And the chapter focuses on Calvin Coolidge and Andrew Mellon. I would argue that, in one sense, I really think Coolidge was the most successful conservative president ever, in the sense that he not only reduced taxes and instituted major tax reform, not only reduced regulation, he presided over an incredible economic boom, and all of those things could be said of Reagan's terms. But the thing that Coolidge could say, it's not a message from the stock exchange, is it? But the thing that Coolidge could say that Reagan very much wanted to say but wasn't able because he didn't control Congress. Coolidge could say that when he left office, the size of the federal government was smaller than when he came in. Fewer people and fewer dollars in the budget. And that was not an accident. It was a result of his total focus. He apparently met weekly with his budget director and with a pencil just marked through item after item after item, week after week after week. And, I think for that reason you could argue that Coolidge was the most successful conservative president. He also was very popular, not only with the public, but with the press, surprisingly. Andrew Mellon was his primary economic advisor as Secretary of the Treasury, and an interesting partner for Coolidge. They both were similar in personalities, men of very few words. It was said they communicated in pauses. But they had a great relationship, and it was that relationship between the two of them that brought taxes down and brought the tax reform that Coolidge was known for. Now, the next 2 chapters are 2 men that I suspect you know very little, if anything, about. In fact, I'm sure of that. And they're 2 sadly forgotten Democrats. So we can say that conservatives, at least the 14 I picked, was a bipartisan effort. Both of these men wrote, I think, very important chapters in conservatism, the history of conservatism in the 20th century in the United States. The first one was a man named Josiah Bailey. He's without question the most obscure of all the 14. He was a Democratic senator from North Carolina in the 1930s and 40s. He was very well regarded as an intellectual thinker, but also a very strong debater and a very good speaker. He was elected, interestingly, as being a pretty normal Democrat. He supported Roosevelt in 1932, but it was very early on in the New Deal, he broke with Roosevelt. He was a very close friend of Carter Glass and Harry Byrd. And he's best known, Josiah Bailey's best known, and the reason I would argue he should be in the book, two events, actually in 1937. The first one was when Roosevelt, after his landslide re-election in 1936, overreached and decided he was going to pack the Supreme Court. It was Bailey who led the fight in the Senate to push back and block that. He was successful in doing it. And then shortly after that, just a matter of a month or so, Bailey, with the help of Carter Glass and Harry Byrd and several conservative Republicans also, Bailey wrote and sponsored something that came very quickly to be known as the Conservative Manifesto, which his hope was that it would be the bipartisan rallying point for a conservative control of the Senate. It was leaked prematurely to the New York Times. It became front page news before they could really round up the support. Not surprisingly, a lot of the more squeamish senators ran for cover, and Bailey was left, gave a great speech on the floor of the Senate defending it. And while the Conservative Manifesto wasn't ultimately successful in 1937, it became the groundwork that Robert Taft built on when he became majority leader in the, or minority leader first and then majority leader in the Senate. The second forgotten Democrat is John W. Davis, who was the last conservative nominated by the Democratic Party for president. He was nominated in 1924. Davis, I would argue, was as fine a man as has ever been nominated for president, just as conservative as Coolidge. As a conservative, if you want to fantasize about having a wonderful choice in an election, think about 1924, when you could decide, did you want to vote for Davis or did you want to vote for Coolidge? Well, the country voted very heavily for Coolidge, and the result of that was that the Democratic Party said, you know, we're not going to try to be more conservative than Republicans. Republicans said, well, we've won a big victory with Coolidge. We'll more or less stay over on the right. And the parties began to converge or to part at that point. Davis remained technically a Democrat for the rest of his life, but he led the opposition beginning in the 1930s to the New Deal. In fact, Roosevelt labeled him public enemy number one, which Davis loved that nickname. And he was an incredibly effective lawyer. He was the senior partner of Davis Polk, a New York law firm that's still very much in existence today. And he was acknowledged as the greatest appellate lawyer probably in American history. Argued more cases before the Supreme Court than any other American except Daniel Webster. And this chapter deals just very specifically with his success in taking New Deal legislation to the Supreme Court and having it overruled as unconstitutional. Very quickly, and then we'll get to questions. Robert Taft, the next chapter, the man known as Mr. Republican, but the important thing to conservatives is he was also Mr. Conservative Republican. He was really responsible for resurrecting the congressional wing of the Republican Party as the conservative alternative to first the New Deal and then the Fair Deal. And again, I think Taft is one of the great individuals in American history. I mean, just a totally honest, honorable politician that even liberals could respect. Kennedy highlighted Taft in his profiles in courage for exactly that, for his political courage. Finally, the last chapter of the book, and let me quickly say that it's certainly my hope and my firm belief that this isn't the last chapter in American conservatism, just happens to be the last chapter in the book. And maybe one of you all will write the appendix, and I hope there'll be a lot more chapters after this one. But the book ends with three men whose lives were very much intertwined and had a huge impact on not only their time, which was the last half of the 20th century, but we still see the impact of these three men, and it's Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan. I think it's very interesting to look back and get the historical context that when Buckley literally burst on the scene as a young Yale graduate in 1950, the intellectual consensus in the U.S. was that conservatism was dead, that you couldn't find any politicians who would even admit that they were conservatives. And Buckley correctly perceived that the American public was more conservative maybe than they even realized at that point. And he was determined to become the voice of responsible conservatism, which he did in founding the National Review and in speaking and debating all over the country. And he single-handedly demolished the view that that conservatism couldn't be an intellectually respectable philosophy. And the result of his success in the marketplace of ideas, if you will, was directly 1964 Goldwater's nomination. And of course, Goldwater's nomination, although unsuccessful very unsuccessful in winning the presidency, launched Reagan on the way to being governor of California and then ultimately as president in 1980 and 84. So I think there's no question that these three men were closely intertwined. Their careers overlapped, and I think it's a real testament to the three of them today. If you look at the Republican Party, we've got, I don't know how many, not sure anybody knows what the final count is on candidates, but whether it's 15 or 16 or 18 or whatever, virtually every single candidate feels it's necessary to at least say he or she is a conservative. Now, there are different gradations in there, but it's a very different picture than it was in 1950, and it's because of these three men, I think. In summary, let me just give you one quote that Reagan made, which I think he was talking about himself, but I think it could absolutely be applied to these 14 leaders. Reagan said, "I never thought of myself as a great man, just a man committed to great ideas. I've always believed that individuals should take priority over the state. History has taught me that this is what sets America apart." So there you have it. I think that can be applied to all 14 of these conservative heroes, 14 leaders who shaped America and certainly shaped American conservatism, Jefferson to Reagan. Thank you.
Don't disappear. I'm not going to answer the questions.
All right, well, you might. You might have to.
We will recognize for those, and if you'd be so kind as to give your name and an affiliation, it would be appreciated. Looking over the list, would you say that all 14 did not have ego problems?
Well, I don't know. I think it's probably unlikely that 14 politicians, that you could say that about any 14 politicians. So I think there probably were ego problems. But I think this is generally true, going back to that quote from Reagan. I think they were all, really without exception, principled men whose first commitment was to these principles and these ideals. To varying degrees, they were successful politicians, and which was good because that aided in implementing their principles. But I would maybe it's just because I like all 14. I think egos were less of a problem than you would normally expect with politicians.
I liked Grover Cleveland for other reasons, even though the Virginians aren't too happy that he vetoed buying Mount Vernon. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, my name's Dave Price. I'm a retired educator and journalist. Obviously, you spent a lot of time researching these 14 men, and you know something about them. And right there are two chairs. So suppose you could sit in one of them, and one of those 14 could sit in the other, and you could have an unlimited talk of an hour or 2 hours. Which one would you choose of the 14?
Well, that's really a hard question because and that gets into the personal realm. I would say that my choice would probably be John Davis, and I would probably define it this way. I think I know this firsthand from Reagan because I can remember when he was president and his appealing personality. But I really think and I of course never knew Davis or saw him or anything, but from what I've read, I think arguably Davis and Coolidge probably were the most attractive. If you're going to go on a trip or stand next to one of them at a cocktail party or something, you wouldn't want to stand next to Coolidge or Mellon, and you wouldn't want to go on a trip with either one of them. But you could respect them a lot, but you wouldn't want to hang out with them, I guess. On the other hand, I think Davis and Reagan were they were just the kind of men that they'd walk in a room and everything would gravitate towards them. And when Davis died, the Washington Post wrote an editorial that said, wherever Mr. Davis sat, that was the head of the table, and that they just kind of had that personality. And Davis could tell a great story, was full of funny jokes like Reagan that all had a point. And so having, from afar, obviously from TV, experienced Reagan more or less personally, I would love to have a chance to experience Davis, but that's kind of a personal thing. Grover Cleveland would probably be fun.
Milton Grenfell, private citizen. You mentioned 2 points that conservatives would all agree on that stuck up in my mind. One was limited government, belief in that, and the other was civic virtue, that's a necessity for a free people. On the first one, there's a recent book by a fellow named Eberstadt here at one of the think tanks that points out that since the 1960s, the number of paychecks from the government going to American citizens has just ballooned. It's like 80% now get some check. I'm not sure Americans believe in limited government anymore. When you ask them questions about the various programs, well, they like them all, okay, the ones that they're into. So I'm not sure much of a belief anymore. And then virtue in the republic, I don't know. As you look around the landscape of our country today, how much of that, where does that stand? So my question on those 2 points alone, are you optimistic about a conservative future?
Well, I certainly share the concerns that you raised. Certainly, when Grover Cleveland wrote those words about the people supporting the government and not the government supporting the people, in his wildest nightmares, he wouldn't have dreamed we would have wound up here. But so I think you're right. We're at it's been a long, slippery slope to where we are now, and to one thing for sure, if there's any hope of reversing it, it's going to take somebody who's a leader or president and control of Congress is very principled and willing to take some heat and who can articulate. I think the only hope is that whoever that leader is, if he can convince the public that if we don't do that, we're going to wind up like Greece. That's our only hope. But it's not an easy thing to communicate and get votes. It's a lot easier to take the Lyndon Johnson approach against Barry Goldwater. Vote for me and I'll look out for you. And don't listen to him. He's going to cut your Social Security. So the conservatives. That was one of Reagan's wonderful attributes. He could say these things in a way that sounded relatively palatable to voters and they could understand them, and we're going to have to figure out some way to do that. And on the private virtue side, I don't know. It's the landscape certainly changed and changing, and but I think it's a critical ingredient, and we just have to hope and pray that it doesn't change too much.
Yes, down here in front.
My name is Charles Carell. I'm actually a student at Washington Lee University.
Good for you.
And thank you.
Well, you should know about John Davis.
Yes, sir.
He's a W&L graduate.
Yes, sir. I was wondering, a lot of the conservatives that you listed, especially with regard to ones that are less well known, were strong defenders of traditional society, and I was wondering the extent to which you think that they can offer any insight into ways to rekindle founding principles, so not just defend traditional society, but in the event that traditional society or traditional values has been minimalized or lost, did they offer insight into ways in which they can be rekindled and reinvigorated?
Well, I think that's a very good question. It's, I guess, my hope and my encouragement in looking at the 14 leaders and their lives. As I mentioned, they each lived in a different era, and so they were called on to address different questions. But I really think, arguably at least, you can find the common thread through all that is are the 5 principles that I outlined, or whether you add to those or not. But so I think that's the common thread. And if you believe that those principles are not only as old as the Republic itself, but really even older, I mean, they went back, a number of them went back to John Locke and Burke and others. If you believe that they were as true today, or are as true today as they were back then, or in any of these other eras, then I think you certainly have to hope, and I think you can believe that, as fickle as the American electorate is, that there will be times when they'll turn to conservatives. And if we are fortunate enough to have a Grover Cleveland or a Calvin Coolidge or a Ronald Reagan in one of those times when the public, for whatever reason, swings a bit to the right and elects a conservative, then I think we can see, because I believe these principles are just as valid today as they were then, and that they're just as true today as they were in whatever period you want to go back to. But there's certainly times when it doesn't seem likely that there's going to be a revival. I mean, I can remember when Reagan was elected in 1980. If somebody had asked me in '78 or even '79 if it was ever going to happen, I would have said, I don't think it's. And then I don't think, I'm sure I wouldn't have predicted. I don't think most conservatives or Republicans would have predicted that Reagan necessarily would have been as great a president as he was. Certainly, the same thing was true of Coolidge and Cleveland. People, when they were elected, didn't really, didn't have high expectations for them.
Young lady here in the back.
Kira Nelson. I'm an associate at Gray Media. You mentioned John Randolph and Nathaniel Macon. Is it Macon or Bacon?
Macon.
Macon.
M-A-C-O-N.
Oh, okay. Can you give us an example of something they did which made them a great conservative? Were there particular policies that they stood up against?
Well, I would say their primary focus, this was true of Macon, and it was. Well, let me back up a second. They were an interesting pair because they were very different personalities. Randolph was volatile. Everybody thought he was brilliant, but people thought he was kind of unstable, or maybe a little unstable. He was acerbic. there were times when he was elected in Virginia in a landslide, then they'd vote him out the next time, he'd make them mad over something. And Macon, on the other hand, was stolid, almost severe, very consistent, never lost an election in North Carolina, retired on his own, could have stayed in office longer. So they were an interesting contrast, but yeah, they were very close friends and saw eye to eye on really on political matter, on almost everything. And I would say the defining thing about both of them was that they were just totally focused on not going down the slippery slope in their minds, or in our minds too, of government reach. They could there are speeches by both of them where they say, well, this bill before Congress it has wonderful intentions, but if we do this, it's going to be just going the wrong direction, so we should not do it. Let the states do it, let the local government do it. And I would say that's what really defined them more than anything else, was just a very strict. Macon, there was a speech he gave. He stood up on the floor and said, I stand up today to say goodbye to an old friend of mine, the Constitution of the United States. But he just thought if you deviated at all from a strict constructionist view, you were going in a dangerous direction. And both of them, sort of for different reasons. Randolph loved to fight. Macon didn't relish a fight like Randolph did, but both of them were willing to stand up to their own party, to Jefferson and Madison on occasion, and were willing to be relegated to Macon served as Speaker for 6 years under Jefferson. Then because he was standing up to Jefferson on some issues, they pushed him out and somebody else became Speaker. He was fine with that. But he didn't change his focus at all. And Randolph was, although a different personality, was very much the same.
We have time for a couple more. Let's go over there.
Yes, sir. My name is Wade Leach, and I am an intern here at the Heritage Foundation. And I'm curious to know, if you were to expand your list, there are two conservative senators from the 20th century that I'm kind of curious to know where they'd fall on that, and those are Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond.
Actually, I really thought about both of them, and I think there's no question that, in my mind at least, they would be very compatible additions to the group. I think, I guess I viewed sort of both of them as being, in some ways, sort of corollary to Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan. I think they weren't byproducts of that. And in fact, Thurmond and Helms were very much in the forefront of advancing Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan. I would put that in the category sort of like Josiah Bailey. I started to write that chapter on Bailey, Glass, and Byrd. Bailey was a great friend of Carter Glass and Harry Byrd, and really the three of them sort of provided the core conservative pushback against the New Deal, but Bailey was the one really more out in front on the court packing and on the conservative manifesto. So and plus I knew nobody would, I figured some people might know Harry Byrd and Carter Glass, but I knew nobody would know Bailey, so I figured I would give him a little more credit. But yeah, I think those two were certainly very important. But again, they were right in the Buckley, Goldwater. Maybe that chapter could have had 5 leaders, but I think it's, and if it had 5, I would argue that Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan were the ones that had the bigger impact.
I was struck, Jeff Barrett, private sector. I was struck by your comment about Coolidge in the 1920s, that he was popular with both the people and the press, of all people.
Yeah.
And so the big change in the psychology of the American population seems to have been the Great Depression. But as we know, in 1921, there was another Great Depression, and the government did nothing, and it was over in 18 months.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you one of these impossible to answer what-ifs. Now, if Coolidge had run for the third term, or even if Davis had been president instead of Hoover, who was an incredible interventionist, do you think that the Depression would have lasted all the way to 1941?
Well, and you're right, it's an impossible question to answer. There's no question in my mind that had Coolidge, and you know, it's not a totally theoretical question, because Coolidge could have run in 1928 and elected not to, and there's no question if he'd run, he'd have been elected. He was very popular. There's no question in my mind that had that happened and had he been president, he would have not done what Hoover did. He would have taken Mellon's advice, which Hoover refused to take Mellon's advice. Mellon's advice was to let everything work out of the system and get it over as fast as you could and not intervene in anything. And Hoover wanted to intervene and prop wages up. And so that would have definitely been different. You know, I mean, to me, one of the most interesting books I've ever read certainly on the Great Depression, but interesting period, was Amity Shlaes' book, The Forgotten Man. And, you know, I think she has a very convincing argument that Hoover, to a lesser extent, and then FDR to a greater extent, turned a very bad recession into the Great Depression, just dragged it out. And, you know, the conservative would argue that the 1920-21 recession is how the free market would deal with a recession, and it's sharp, painful, short, and then you get on with normal growth. Yeah, but it's hard to say. I think you can say with certainty that Coolidge would not have done what Hoover did. And, you know, it's possible. Now, I don't know, it's probably, if Davis had been president, there's no question he would not have signed the Smoot-Hawley or whatever the tariff thing was. Davis was a free trade guy, and Coolidge was sort of a mild tariff guy. And so I don't know what he would have done on Smoot-Hawley, but he certainly wouldn't have been an interventionist in the economy. So I think there's the possibility that it might have been just a really bad, sharp recession instead of the Great Depression. And the country might be very different today. Absolutely.
Thank you, Carlin.
Thank you.
We do have copies of his book available, and he can sign them out in the foyer if you would like to do that. The one reason I liked Grover Cleveland, and I don't know if you've mentioned it in the book per se, but he may be the last president who, when he vetoed a bill, said that he did not believe the federal government had the authority to spend the funds they were asking him to spend, which would be a totally new idea in America. Thank you again for your attendance. We'll see you at a future occasion.